Solly Mapaila, SACP's General Secretary, says the National Democratic Revolution is stagnant due to a lack of leadership. Well, Mapaila joins me now for a further discussion on this. A very good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time. Sanko is saying and calling on you to lead South Africa and unite the alliance. What is your reaction to that?
Well, my understanding, firstly, good afternoon, point to our viewers as well. My understanding was that Comrade Chris was expressing challenges that we face and called on the role of the Communist Party. Yes, the Communist Party will be there to work with our communities to resolve problems that we face in our communities. That is why our own program adopted at our 15th Congress called for working with communities to build a socialist movement of the workers and poor. And that requires us remodeling the manner in which we have operated in communities in different spheres of society. And I think that's what I understood him to be saying. To that extent, we will work together with our allies, including Sanko, COSATU and the ANC, and other progressive formations, and even those that are outside this fold, because this movement that we are seeking, it's a movement of the people. In communities, this should be a non-sectarian movement, because the ideals that the liberation forces in this country had represented still remain relevant, and we can achieve those ideals if we work together and not only rely on representatives in government who are sitting over an economic system that has not yet transformed. It is not even responding to the basic needs of the people. In fact, it lives on the government and continues to blame the very same government for its own abilities, even for the weaknesses of government itself, when actually it has usurped all power and capacity that is there in government into the private sector through its modeling of neoliberal economic system. And it is that which has further deepened the crisis that we see in our country. And we have seen equally different social services going down or falling precisely because of the austerity measures and the neoliberal posture that we have taken also as government, with the influence of the most critical bodies in the world, the capitalist corporations, the IMF, the World Bank themselves as institutions, although they were meant to be institutions of world governance, but they've become institutions of world capitalist system, and they don't care about the well-being of any people anywhere except usurping resources of those countries through their government.
And what we have noted is that the standard of living for the poor and the working class is getting worse. Things are not looking better. Who must be held accountable here, especially as South Africa's youth continue to bear the brunt of unemployment? I mean, looking at the numbers here, the unemployment rate in the first quarter of this year stood at 63.9% for those 15 to 24 and 42.1% for those aged 25 to 34-year-olds. It really paints a very grim picture of the future.
Yes, most certainly. We call upon our youth to join us in our communities. We're relaunching programs for self-sustainability, because we realize that calling on governments to do this and that sometimes takes too long. And people cannot, on the one hand, postpone being hungry or being sick or having major difficulties. So we need to respond to those challenges that communities faces as a matter of urgency. That's a serious crisis that we are talking about. I mean, even the crisis of energy, but the whole problems of deepening inflation or rising inflation in our communities, in our economy, is largely a consequence of the role of international capital, NATO and the U.S. aggression against Russia on the Ukraine war, and the current military escalation across the world led by the USA itself. So it is primarily the capitalist centers that are causing the problems, and the compliant regimes, including our treasury here in South Africa and South African Reserve Bank, that continues to comply with prescripts of these institutions without considering the actual conditions of the people in this country. As an independent democratic government, we should be having our own assessment of how to respond to the rate of unemployment in our communities, for instance. Even our education system, our universities, TVET colleges need to be responding to the social challenges that we face. But if, for instance, we are not looking into that, we have a rural South Africa that is extremely underdeveloped, or township South Africa that is extremely underdeveloped as well, although better than the rural areas. But all of this will require a state willing to intervene and involve itself in massive infrastructure investment and involvement, which will require massive industrialization and funding for industrialization. We have had a program on industrialization, which the Reserve Bank could not fund because it was in direct competition. The Treasury could not fund because it was in direct competition with international capital. So that's not what we need. We need a state that will respond to the needs of the people on the ground, because government is there for all the people, not for a section of the people, which is the capital class.
A state that responds. What about those tasked with steering the national democratic revolution? I mean, where are the leaders? I mean, the strides that have been made and the gains since 1994 are almost hard to see today.
Yes, there are major gains that we have scored, obviously, or we have achieved, and those gains need to be defended by all of us. That is why, for instance, the Communist Party was actually the first organization to launch a program to defend public infrastructure in communities as a political organization. So we didn't just call on government, but we launched campaign, and we are calling on communities to join us to defend the progress that has been made by this country, including public property, because public property is the common good of all of us as citizens. But we are equally calling on the government to really respond effectively, the political leadership to respond effectively, and also to engage communities and society about the challenges that it faces. Because at the moment, it is the only one that has been blamed, and yet it had tenderized everything. We called more than a decade ago as a Communist Party for the detenderization of the state, because we could see that this process, the state was losing critical skills into the private sector, because those who were working in the state will then jump into the private sector, get given tenders to continue the work that they were doing in the state. And the state waned in capacity, hence the challenges that sometimes we see. But it's precisely because there's been a narrative that says government doesn't create jobs, government doesn't create employment or development, is the private sector that does that. We don't say private sector cannot play a role. They can play a role. They've got too much money of the South African workers, particularly, for instance, if you go into the fund industry in this country, whether it's the retirement funds and others, they've got money in trillions. Several trillions, over 10 trillions, bigger than the budget that the state has.
Sure.
Is deployed in other parts of the country, not
Mr.
in
Mapaila,
the real needs in this country.
We're going to have to cut our conversation short, and thank you for your time there, Solly Mapaila, SACP's General Secretary, speaking to some of the strides that have been made and what needs to be done to make this country even better. In a moment.